Welcome back, everybody, to What's Next. I am so excited for this week's episode. And I know I say that every single week. I'm pretty sure I've started this the same way every single week, but it's not because it's not true. It is true. Every single week, I love the guests that I'm talking to. I love the conversations that I'm having, and I feel like I'm learning from every single guest, and I hope you guys are too. But this week was definitely very fascinating because I am talking to my good friend Jackie. She is a PhD student at Berkeley in the Sociology department. And Jack and I have known each other for a very long time. And still hearing her talk about her decisions and her process and her research was so fascinating. It is not something that we've really spent time discussing before. And so to hear her talk about the work that she does with the passion that she has was incredible to see and hear. She, I will say, has some amazing and very useful advice regarding the application process, and also just what to look for in a PhD program, which I think is incredibly helpful if you are interested in going into academia and pursuing a PhD. I think it was such an eye-opening conversation for me, and I'm not planning on going into academia. So I hope it's helpful to anyone who is thinking about it. So take a listen and enjoy. Jackie, you are currently a PhD student in sociology. We're going to start with, firstly, why sociology?
Why sociology? That's a great question. I think to start, I will explain or attempt to explain at least a little bit of what sociology is, though I think it maybe means something a little different to different people. But I think of sociology as kind of the explanation of social phenomenon, of like why society is structured the way that it is, or why certain things are happening in our social world. And I think what was so attractive to me about sociology is it has a real focus in inequality and in theoretically trying to improve inequality, to make change. Different academics have different stances on like to what extent any work is political, to what extent you should be kind of doing politics with your work. And I don't think I have been in the field long enough to really say that I have a super concrete opinion on that point. But I think the focus on trying to isolate issues of inequality and try to make things better for people who have been disadvantaged in some way is something that is really attractive, though you can always get into the issues of the ivory tower and highlighting problems but not actually changing them. But sociology, compared to some other social sciences in particular, has also a pretty big focus on policy change. Yeah. And while writing about policy and suggesting policy does not equate actually enacting policy, I think, to me, I've just always cared about inequality and cared about making the world better. And I like the idea of taking kind of a really wide-ranging view about inequality and figuring out, like at the macro scale, what's going on and how you could maybe actually try to help individual people once you've figured out something that maybe is much broader scale than any one person.
Well, right. Why don't we then dig into your research? What are you hoping to find in your PhD?
That's a great question. So I am towards the early stage. I'm currently working on a master's thesis, which is a milestone that happens for certain programs, and does for mine. And so it's sort of, I see it as kind of the early work of my dissertation, or perhaps the first chapter of my dissertation. And I'm currently I'm broadly interested in access to higher education, particularly for low-income students. And the way that I'm focusing that interest right now specifically is on higher ed admissions and whether class has become more salient, like in college admissions at the field-wide level. So I'm interested in I guess perhaps like a more meso level for this portion. If you think of macro as kind of like countries or economic policy, like capitalism is a macro theory. I'm interested for now in sort of the meso level. So like institutions, companies, colleges, firms, communities is another like meso level sort of, and then micro level being individual people, obviously. So I think that I'm really interested in how colleges as institutions are shaping like the people who are able to access these schools. And I think that, there obviously are factors that contribute to a college applicant's competitiveness that are before you arrive at college. There's early childhood development, K through 12 education, which is all really important too. But I'm really interested in the kinds of exclusion that are taking place, like when you're applying to college, when you're matriculating into college. So how that's shaping out right now is I'm kind of looking at different policies that are associated with class. Unfortunately, there's no like one like class-based policy in the way that like race-based affirmative action is very easy to find. What, like, do they do it? Do they not do it? And class is a little more murky because certain colleges are pretty socioeconomically diverse. Certain colleges are not, either because they have a lot of low-income students or a lot of really wealthy students. And so it's not really quite as clear what the picture is in terms of class. And I think other than after the Supreme Court decision that made affirmative action unconstitutional, people have really started focusing on class, but it really hasn't been the focus of research literature in the same way as like race has been in college admissions. Or when it is talked about, it's focused on maybe one school or one or two schools. And I'm interested really like at the broad level, have colleges started to think about class? Have they done anything to make it easier for low-income students to apply or harder for low-income students to apply? And then once that's kind of clear, what is it actually doing? So like translating policy to practice, and how many of these policies are like look really good and make it seem as if they're letting in or supporting a lot of low-income students, but like, what is it actually doing? How many students is it affecting? Like, for example, the way that I like to think about it is that like a lot of particularly elite colleges talk about having like, families who make under $75,000 a year do not have to pay a cent of tuition. That's like Harvard has it. A lot of Ivy League colleges have it. Plenty of other colleges have it. But that doesn't actually say anything about the number of low-income students who are getting in.
Yeah.
And so I'm really interested in like, what are they saying? Like, what are they signaling to other people, to society that obviously has a value? But then what are they doing? And how is it like, are these things doing anything? Or is it sort of like window dressing that looks really nice, but doesn't actually reflect any kind of institutional change?
Yeah.
So
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, like how meso-level policies are affecting individual people. The first part of the question is easier to answer than the second part. So I am starting with the first part, and then I will figure out how to get an answer to the second part once I've done something.
I mean, that is a lot to tackle, but I feel like is very important work and will be really interesting to discover. So you are currently, you said, working towards your master's. And so you have to get your master's before you start on the PhD track. Is that how that works? Can you briefly discuss how the overarching timeline works in terms of a PhD?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is like pretty particular to American PhD programs.
Right.
Probably even more specifically, particular to the social sciences. I have some sense of how non-social science PhDs work, but it's obviously different depending on the discipline. I know that even in the social sciences in Europe, oftentimes students enter with a master's from another institution and then start their PhD, and it's a shorter period. But in the US, for social science and even for other STEM or humanities programs, it often includes like a master's milestone, even if you've actually gotten a master's in something else already. So it looks a little bit different for every program and every discipline, but generally the beginning of a PhD in the United States starts with coursework. Depending on the discipline, it varies a lot. Particularly in like STEM disciplines, you come to the PhD having probably majored in the subject already and knowing a lot. Certain social science PhD programs are more open in terms of the backgrounds of students. I think the more interdisciplinary a program is, the more likely they will be to admit students who haven't necessarily done a major in that subject. And so the coursework allows everyone to kind of get on the same page in terms of terminology, research methods, things that they might not have necessarily done in undergrad. So that's the stage I'm in right now. I'm in my second year. So I'm taking classes, and most programs have a master's paper. It's or like a kind of a second year milestone paper. It really depends on the discipline, how formalized that is. For STEM disciplines that publish a lot more papers and a lot more frequently, there's not this like huge, long 2-year long paper process, because often students are in labs with a lot of graduate students and a professor who heads the lab, and there's a little bit more structure and ways to kind of work on things in a way that gets you sort of like up to speed. And there's not as much work that's going on by yourself. Like sole authorship on STEM papers is basically not existent. You're never writing a paper alone and publishing it with just your name. But for the social sciences, or at least for sociology, writing a paper by yourself is pretty common, if not like quite necessary for the job market. And so the master's paper serves as like kind of a first milestone and a way to have a paper that's written that you can get published while you're working on your dissertation. So that especially if you write kind of like a book length project for your dissertation, you have something publishable before then. And different programs have like different sort of structures. They're all geared towards the job market in general. So some people have a paper and you have to present at a conference to get your master's. Some, I don't. I just have to write a paper and complete coursework. I have, after my master's, my program requires qualifying exams, which are oral exams in 3 subfields that basically kind of encourage you or require you to become an expert in these 3 subfields. And it kind of makes you ready to teach like a seminar on that particular subfield. So you read and you write memos and you like think about all of this literature that's in one particular subfield. So like race, culture, education, organizations, there's all sorts of things that you can choose from, and you leave kind of an expert in that particular subfield, or in the major literatures within that field. And then after that, finally, you would write a proposal for a dissertation and complete your dissertation. So it's a long process with a lot of steps, and I think each discipline kind of looks a little bit different in terms of
how it really works.
Yeah, certain. Like I think in the lab sciences where you're with a lab-based model, I think it's a little bit different because your PI, your primary investigator, I believe it's like the faculty member who heads the lab, has like a kind of focus, and you come in with that same focus, but you're working with someone who has priorities that might not be exactly the same as your own. Whereas for me, I collaborate with faculty on other papers, but everything that I produce for the PhD is something I'm producing on my own with guidance from other people, but like it's my own research agenda. It's what I want to do. And it's not really, I'm not really forced down a specific path by anyone other than in the ways of getting guidance and advice. So obviously like the individual milestones and how a PhD works, depending on what discipline you are in is very different, but like the overall arc is the same of course taking. Maybe you have some sort of paper milestone. Some students are more serious about like actually getting awarded their master's versus just doing the things. And you theoretically could ask the university to send you a diploma, but no one really necessarily gets it. And then eventually you get to the end. When you file your dissertation proposal, you become all but dissertation, or ABD. And at that point, you're a doctoral candidate and you just have to send them your dissertation and then you're done. But it can take between 4 and 10 years, depending on your discipline, if you have to do a master's requirement, which like in the United States, even for public health PhDs, I don't think you have to do one. So it's shorter. It's more like 4 years.
Got it.
The average is like 5 or 6 years. So it's a long process.
Is that how long you are expecting to take? 5 to 6 years?
I'm funded for 6, so I'm not going to finish early. Typically you're funded for either 5 or 6 years, and depending on what your funding looks like, that kind of determines how long you could stay later. So funding can look like teaching. You're paid to teach, and that you have extra time outside of your teaching to work on your own work, or it can look like being a research assistant and being paid to work on research. And so that's more dependent on grant funding. And when the grant runs out that's funding your research, you have to leave. Whereas if you are funded through teaching and the institution you are at has a serious need for teaching, so particularly public colleges, then you can probably stay as long as they need teachers.
As long as they need you. That makes sense. So given that you said earlier that a lot of this is geared towards the job market, what do you hope to do after you have completed your PhD?
Great question. I'm hoping to be a professor. I think that the labor market for academia is tight. It's differentially tight. I think that it's less competitive in certain fields than others. In terms of a sociology PhD or even a social science PhD, I think the most logical outcome of getting a PhD is academia. I think that there are plenty of other paths you can pursue, but there are perhaps more economically rational ways to get to those outcomes than this path, which is long. And while I do get paid, I get paid not a lot of money. So I am losing a lot of theoretical wages by taking, 6 years to get a degree. But there are plenty of other non-academic opportunities, even from a social science PhD. You can go work in policy.
Right.
Depending on what you're doing, Microsoft, Facebook, technology companies hire social scientists all the time. It really just sort of depends on what work you're doing. I think there are like a lot of exit opportunities that you can get creative with if that's what you want, but I do think you could probably get to those things in a different route, and that might work financially better, because you see a huge financial sacrifice. I think you should think about what you really want to do afterwards, and is getting a PhD in direct service of that. And are there other ways to get to that point without a PhD, unless you have if you're very lucky to have extreme financial stability, obviously that changes things. But when I applied, I was told that I needed to be willing to live in Nebraska or in the middle of nowhere in upstate New York, or basically anywhere, if I really wanted to be sure that I could get an academic job. And that is something that I still am not 100% sure on, and definitely is part of the sacrifice of wanting to work in academia. You really have to be willing to go anywhere if you want that kind of opportunity.
Yeah.
In STEM fields, there are a lot of people exit to finance, industry, and it's a lot more common, I think, particularly because the academic labor market is extremely tight.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely a lot to think about, but for now, you're loving your research, and that, like, we'll get to what drew you to this decision a little bit later. But I also want to ask, do you have a hope for what impact your research has? And I'm not specifically talking about what you're doing now for your PhD, but you're going to go into academia. You are going to continue to research, I'm assuming. So then what do you hope your research will do?
Oh my God. Yeah, I don't think I would be doing this if I didn't think that I would have an impact on people. I mean, especially in a field that's really interested in equality, to think that like you would do all this work and it wouldn't affect people. I think when I think about what I hope to do and what I hope, like what effect I hope I would have on the world, I think there are two things that I think about primarily. That's students that I'd be teaching and the effect I can have on students, and then the effect that my research could have on people that are in the sorts of situations that my research focuses on. So I think different people have a different level of interest in teaching, but I think I feel really strongly about the importance of teaching, the importance of reaching out to students who maybe haven't had as much focus from teachers if they were in, for example, high schools that are under-resourced, or like maybe they were in really huge class sizes when they were in high school or in college. I think there are, students come from such a variety of backgrounds, and there's kind of a prototypical ideal student that's based on like the rich white men that these institutions were founded for. And I don't think that that's what education should be. And so I feel really strongly about paying it forward. The only reason I'm even here is because I had faculty members who believed in me and who encouraged me. And I think I would be so disappointed if I didn't have that effect on hopefully a lot of students, regardless of if they end up going down the academia route or not. I really just want to make students feel heard and valued, and hopefully have an impact on the way they think or the way they see the world. And then, of course, like, to do research and not affect anyone would be so depressing. I think that I care a lot about, I'm like, my research is pretty focused on class, but I think I'm generally just interested in making the US a fairer place. Yeah. It's a very fair place. And I would do almost anything to ensure that things are different, that like college processes are different.
I now want to focus on the details of your everyday as a PhD student. So why don't you start with, indeed, what is a typical day for you?
I think something that attracted me about the PhD originally is that there's no typical day. You are your own boss, and you can decide when you work, how long you work, how much you work on, what you work on, how much you get done. And that has its advantages and its serious disadvantages. It's definitely really hard to keep motivated when you are responsible for yourself. And there's no boss yelling at you if you don't finish your work. Right now in the coursework phase, there's a little bit of structure in that I have class on campus. I have assignments for class. And eventually, once I'm done with my coursework, I'll be teaching, which again provides structure in that I have to teach. I have to go to office hours. I have to go to class. I have to prepare for class. But research, really, there's like nothing typical about it. I think the things that I do the most, I would say, are reading articles, writing memos, either on my research or on the articles. And honestly, the thing I spend the most time right now doing in my research work is getting data. It takes forever to get data. I'm trying to get quantitative data sets that are owned by other people. So I have just been spending a lot of time like emailing people, trying to figure out where the data is stored. But for people who aren't trying to get access to existing data sets, collecting data is a huge part of doing research. And that can look like a lot of different things. It can look like fielding survey, doing interviews, doing ethnographic work, which is spending an extended amount of time in a place, kind of integrating yourself into the everyday life there. So I would say there really is no typical day. I think that people try to create structure by saying, I'm only going to work from 9 to 5. People time block, but I have honestly not figured out what the right typical day is for me. And that's something I'm still learning how to be my own boss, I would say.
That's very fair. It sounds quite similar in a way to undergrad. What would you say are the biggest similarities and differences between undergrad and obviously this ginormous undertaking that you've taken on as a PhD student?
That's so interesting that you say that, because I think of it as being so different, but I also worked in between, and I think I have a bit of a different mindset coming back to grad school than I perhaps would have if I had gone straight from undergrad. I really do think of it as a job. I think of it as a job where I'm very fortunate to be learning and thinking and using my mind, but it's not learning for the sake of learning. It's not always learning what I'm super interested in. I have to do what I have to do, and I can focus my research on things I'm interested in, but I have to take classes that maybe I wouldn't take if I weren't required to. I have to learn these things to be a good professor, or to teach well, or to just kind of know about what other people are doing. Or some of it's related to my work and some of it's not, but it's more helpful than it is not helpful. Like, it's kind of vocational in a sense, even though it's doing a lot of the same things that you do in undergrad. There's very much this outcome at the end that you're always sort of hyper focused on, for better or for worse, which is publishing, getting a job, writing research that's interesting and successful. But you're right. When I describe my everyday, it does really sound like my
just
my
in terms
everyday.
of the like flexibility that you have. But I actually have heard from a lot of people who have gone to grad school that they do see it differently. They do see it as it is a job, and because they had the structure of a job in between, especially if they didn't go straight through, they had that structure of a job, and so they can bring that mindset into their graduate degree. So that makes total sense. I want to talk about how you are affording life. You talked about funding earlier, but I can't imagine that you are getting funded that much.
No. It's I go to a public school. I'm at Berkeley. It's public. It's obviously a very well-funded public school, and that's a privilege, but there are certainly issues across the board with the financialization of higher education, something that I'm interested in my own work that I will not bore you with today. And they don't pay us very much. I'm guaranteed $34,000 a year, which is well below the cost of living in the Bay Area. I work,
is for sure.
yeah, it's not great. I work this year, in my second year, I've been working an extra job as a research assistant. So I think I probably will make about like $45,000 this year. Again, that's still under the cost of living in the Bay Area, unfortunately. And I'm actually fortunate to probably make more than a lot of graduate students in the UC system. And we had a historic strike last year that made, for some, pretty significant gains, and for others, pretty modest gains. And even the gains we made have been reversed by the university. They've unilaterally reclassified us from one teaching classification that was slightly better paid to a lower teaching classification that's paid less, to avoid paying us the wins that we got in our strike. So universities are really formidable employers in that they do not want to pay their teaching labor, even at a school that relies heavily on graduate students for teaching, which is honestly like pretty depressing and disappointing. But the financial structure of universities is a much bigger issue that people who are much more knowledgeable than I should speak on. But if it's something you're interested in, there are lots of books out there. But also to say, to make that work, there are a lot of ways, some easier than others. I think, just to be perfectly frank, a lot of people are fortunate to have partners who work real jobs and can subsidize them by paying a bigger share of the rent. Obviously, you can split an apartment, and it's ridiculous that that's what has to happen, or that's how most people get by, but it's just a fact of life, and I do want to be honest about that.
Yeah.
A lot of people work extra jobs to make money on the side. Obviously, that slows down your progress, and there's a lot of economic privilege in even being able to do a PhD at all, because if you have student debt, you cannot pay your student debt and eat on $34,000 a year, or even really on $40,000 a year in a place that's extremely expensive or has a very high cost of living. So there's a lot of inequality inherent in basically like every step of the graduate school process. There's a lot of inequality, but I think particularly in the cost of living situation. And that said, private schools is a lot better, and certain disciplines are better paid than others. So a lot of STEM fields, you're paid a higher stipend to ensure that these programs can stay competitive, because, to go to get a PhD in computer science, you could be making hundreds of thousands of dollars as a software engineer. And obviously you don't even make $100,000 as a computer science PhD, but they pay a little bit better to ensure that they have a competitive set of applicants. But even at private schools, like I know that at Harvard or Stanford, which are similarly ranked as Berkeley in terms of the sociology departments, they pay like probably $10,000 more, if not more, maybe $15,000 more.
Wow, that's a significant difference. Does your stipend stay the same for as long as you're doing the PhD? So even when you get to the point where you're teaching, do you earn more, or does it always stay at this 34,000?
I think it depends on the school. We have despite the fact that we didn't make that many wins in our historic strike, We do have experience-based wage raises now. So when you've taught for, I think it's like 3 or 4 semesters, you get paid like a step up and you get a bit of a pay raise. And that's for teaching or for research. So we actually do get a slight raise with incremental increases in experience. Does it match the pace of inflation lately? I'm actually not sure, but we do technically get more money. But that is pretty new, and that's not the case for most students. So most students get locked in at a certain rate, and it doesn't change unless you're working on top of that. Yeah. So right now, for example, I'm on a fellowship where I'm paid to do nothing in return. Like they pay me money and I get to do my own thing. And my pay stays the same even when I start working. So then my hourly rate goes down because I'm paid to work and then I have to do my work on the side. So it really depends on every person's situation. People who are working in the lab technically get paid for 20 hours a week, but they work full time at this lab. And it's sort of like they straddle sort of a different situation where their work is also their PI's work. And so they're paid and they work full time for their PI, though it's technically not full time. It's like a kind of strange situation. But a lot of the pay depends on how strong your union is at the institution and how resourced your institution is. So, Berkeley is a even though we don't get paid that much, like highly resourced institution, and there are schools that don't actually pay their graduate students at all. So there's a pretty big inequality in terms of like where you go to get your PhD vastly determines the resources that you get, the amount of financial security that you have. And, Berkeley is a pretty elite research institution across every field. So it's crazy to say that I'm probably like in the fortunate few, despite the fact that no one can really live in the Bay Area on $34,000 a year.
Not.
But I mean, people make it work, but there have been plenty of stories of students, especially with kids, not eating so that they can afford to feed their kids, students being homeless. It's obviously like you choose to do this knowing what you're getting into, but it's definitely, I think, concerning that, we don't, especially at a school that uses graduate students for teaching labor to a pretty extensive degree, that there's not a little bit more of a value placed on that work in terms of financial incentive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Wow. Well, on that note of this financial incentive and why you chose to do this in the first place, let's go and dive into that. What did make you decide to apply to grad school?
I fell in love with research. At the very last minute, at the end of college, my senior fall, I took my required sociology research methods class. I was a sociology major in undergrad too. And for the first time kind of realized that like social science research is a thing. Like I knew that it existed, but I never really saw myself doing something like that. I actually had a completely different career plan. I wanted to go into the arts. I wanted to be a Broadway producer. And I took this mandatory class that I'm sure no one was as interested in as I was. And I caught the bug. I don't know. I think I find active current social research, like looking at what's happening right now in our society, I find just so fascinating. And I think I wanted something that felt intellectually stimulating. I love to read. I wanted to be able to read. I loved the idea of teaching. I did not teach or TA in college, but I always wanted to. And so teaching was definitely a big part of it. But then honestly, like the biggest part of why I applied was because I mentioned how interested I was in the class, and the professor strongly encouraged me to consider grad school and served as a resource for me as I was kind of working through whether this would be something I would want to do. And I never would have considered it as a path for me, even with parents who are highly educated, if not for this person saying, like, I think you would be great. I think you should consider this. I think you would be a great fit for a competitive graduate program. You should do it. And in addition to that professor, the TA in the class was super supportive. I then approached another professor who was very supportive and ended up serving as my advisor for my thesis. And part of why I'm so passionate about teaching is because I literally wouldn't be here if not for professors who cared enough to encourage me to do something that I never would have found on my own. So I think that it started with a little tiny baby interest in research, but really got nourished by these people who took time out of their very busy schedules to mentor me when I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah, that's amazing. So what were the requirements to apply for your sociology PhD?
The requirements, so we had to take the GRE at the time. I think it's kind of fading away. No one's ever really cared about it in the sociology world. I mean, I'm sure people cared at different degrees, but the GRE was a requirement for most programs. I did apply during the mid-COVID era. I applied in 2021. So certain things were relaxed like the GRE, but for some programs more so than others. And then besides that, you have to, submit your grades, your GPA, your transcript. But the things that you kind of have to produce in order to apply are primarily a statement of purpose, which is like a combination of a personal statement and a research proposal. So you write about kind of like who you are, why you want to apply to graduate school, like what about sociology interests you, and then also what you want to do with your PhD and how the professors at that particular program are positioned to support you in that endeavor.
So you kind of had to know what you wanted to research.
Yes, I had an idea. That said, people apply with an idea and completely change their mind. People write. So the National Science Foundation has a fellowship program that most students who can apply, like anyone who's in a science or social science discipline, will apply. And people will write that application, which you talk about what you want to do and then completely change. So things can change a lot at the application stage and at the early stages. I know people who wrote their master's on something and then switched to something completely different for their dissertation. So there's a little bit of flexibility if there are faculty in that other area of interest that can support you. It's a little harder if you decide you want to switch completely and there's no one there to really help you with that. But you do have to have a sense of what you're doing. And this is one of the kind of inflection points where there's like a lot of privilege and a lot of inequality. Like I had professors who helped me hone my ideas, who gave me comments and feedback on my statement of purpose, who helped me kind of work through my ideas, which were really vague and broad, and get them to be specific enough that they were compelling for a PhD application. And obviously I was at a small private college, and people at bigger public schools might not have the kind of one-on-one experience with professors, or professors might not have time to help with those sorts of things at schools that are not as resourced. So there are books that help with sort of this process. I will recommend one, which is A Field Guide to Grad School, and it covers the application and the enrollment and beyond period. And that can really help with kind of figuring out, it's about grad school in general, but it's written by a sociologist. So I think it's particularly helpful for people in the social sciences. But that is really helpful for people who might not have access to like the same level of institutional knowledge that I did through these professors who were really had my back and were really pushing. And then besides the statement of purpose, you need 2 to 3 recommendation letters from faculty. And those, I think, are very important, which obviously confers yet another source of inequality, in that professors from certain institutions carry more weight in terms of their recommendations than others, and professors who are more senior or more esteemed carry more weight than others. But those are the professors who don't necessarily want to spend time with students. I was very fortunate that my recommenders were esteemed and spent a lot of time encouraging students and mentoring students, but that's not always the case, of course. Berkeley actually requires you to write a separate statement of purpose, like a research statement, and then a personal statement. But that was the only program that required that. And then a diversity statement is increasingly either recommended or required. So I wrote diversity statements for some schools. Some schools didn't have them. I think they're probably becoming more popular these days, but those are the general requirements. Wow. I think it's a little probably for other disciplines, but
how did you balance working full time and doing all of those requirements, studying for the GRE, writing all this, and getting the application in?
It was rough. It's not, some people like me procrastinate, and I don't recommend that. I decided to write my applications and study for the GRE all at the same time. And thank goodness Berkeley at least doesn't care that much about the GRE, because I certainly could have done better had I not done those two things at the same time. It's hard. And I had a job that was really strictly 9 to 5. So I thankfully didn't have a job where I was working 80, 100 hours a week. I don't know how you would do this if you were working 80 or 100 hours a week. I basically just most days from September through December when they were due, probably 4 days a week, if not more, I was working after work for 2-3 hours on my applications, or on studying. And it was kind of like it was like a part-time job basically.
Yeah.
And I applied to 11 programs, which is more than some people and fewer than others. I know someone who applied to like 20, which is insane, but I strongly, strongly recommend trying to take the GRE first and getting it out of the way before you apply, and not writing all of your statements at the same time, because that was so hard. Thankfully, the statement of purpose is broadly one thing that you write for everyone, and then you kind of tack on a paragraph about the program at the end. But even just that takes time. It's really intimidating to write something that is being judged as your competence and your worthiness of admission for this thing you really want. And starting is so much harder than actually just like writing it and editing it and refining it. So I think the hardest part for me was getting actually words on the page and getting an idea, no matter how, it was really probably terrible at the beginning, but that is the hardest part. So I would say start early and just start and write something. And maybe it's terrible, but at least it's something that people can help you with and that you can help yourself with. And this is actually my advice for anyone writing anything, is to just start and write a really shitty first draft. And then you can fix it later, but you can't fix something that's not there
on the page. Those are definitely some very important tips that I'm sure a lot of people appreciate. So then, do you know, and you may not know this, what made you stand out about in your application?
I think that is so specific, not only to the applicant, the individual applicants, but also to the committee. Like, different people select, at least in my department, and I think this is probably the case for every sociology department, different people select the class every year. So you have no idea who's running the search, or not the search, but the application process, what their thoughts are, what their priorities are. And the classes look very different depending on who's evaluating the application. So, if they're, for example, in a year where, 3 of the 4 professors are interested in a certain kind of subfield, like, let's just call it like economic sociology, for example, you'll find that there are perhaps more students who are interested in economic sociology who are in that year. So there's a politics to who's on the committee and what they care about and what they value in students. And so cohorts can look really, really different depending on who's on the committee. I know for a fact, like a professor who was on the committee when I applied told me that she just really loved my sort of outlook on sociology, my interest in organizations. She's an organizational scholar, and pushed really hard for me because I was interested in the kinds of things that she's interested in, and people push for the kinds of people you become interested in people who are interested in the same things as you, or who see things in the way that you see things. And so there's a slant to every committee, but it's a different slant every year, which makes it kind of an ever-shifting target. But certain departments have different kind of reputations, and I knew that I was not necessarily a good fit at certain departments and was a really good fit at others. And so there were acceptances I was surprised by and acceptances I wasn't surprised by, and rejections I was surprised by and rejections I wasn't surprised by. I think that what committees are really evaluating, like more than anything, I think is whether you can actually like do the PhD and finish the program, because they're paying you and they don't want to pay someone to drop out. Obviously, it's an investment. They're investing in you. And so what I think is most important to show on your statement of purpose is that you know what this endeavor entails, that you have a specific enough interest that you could at least get started on something, and that you've identified people at that department who will help you be successful. So if you go on their website and there is no one in the area of interest that works at that department, just don't even waste your time applying and your money applying, because you won't be successful when you get there, and they're not going to let you in, because if you don't have anyone to mentor you, you will not finish. You won't graduate. It's not going to happen. So I think the main thing that they're interested in is like, do I think this person has like the ability and the understanding of what they're getting into to finish? And then the second question is, do I think that they can think about research questions? And that is perhaps an ever-moving target. I don't even know if I'm still very good at thinking of research questions. And obviously, again, huge privilege in having amazing faculty who help me think through my research questions and refine them. And not everyone has that. But thinking about research questions that are important and motivating them and explaining why they matter and are they well-formed. And that is not something that any applicant can do on their own. That is something that you have to get help from faculty on. And that obviously is, again, another hurdle that people have to pass through is asking for help and getting help, and how helpful is that help and support. So what I would recommend in terms of structuring your application for success is making it clear what experiences you've had so far that would allow you to do this extraordinarily isolating, extraordinarily self-directed process, and why you would be successful in this process. And then just, if you have like a little kernel of interest, like I think really asking for help and asking for feedback on everything you write, even if you're afraid, is really the best way to set yourself up for success, because no one knows better than the faculty members who sit on these committees and then hide the ways of being successful from other people than the faculty members sitting on these committees. But it is a very, very opaque process. Yeah. So you can really get so much help from anyone who's not a faculty member. Though we have a graduate student member of the Berkeley Admissions Committee, which I am planning on doing when I'm qualified to do so that I can
come back on and tell us all the secrets. That would be fabulous.
Exactly. But I only have guesses as to why I was successful.
No, but that was all very, very helpful. And then in terms of, you mentioned earlier that there were some acceptances that surprised you and acceptances that didn't surprise you, and so on and so forth. Out of those acceptances, you are then obviously deciding between the programs that you got into. So what ultimately pulled you towards one program or another?
When I was deciding between programs, to be, upfront, I applied to 11 schools. I think I got accepted at 4. And I applied to highly selective programs, so I think 4 was amazing. I was weighing a few factors: location, stipend, and then like faculty support and long-term labor market outcome. So between the 4 that I was accepted at, 2 of them were in places I wasn't really excited about living in, and places that my partner wasn't really excited about living in. So I kind of just cut them from the start. While they were both great programs, between the 2 that I was really considering, they were extremely different. Berkeley and the other program were extremely different across basically like every facet. So it was actually a very strange thing to be comparing. The other program was on the East Coast. It was a private school. Berkeley's a public school on the West Coast. The faculty at Berkeley there's no person who's necessarily a scholar of higher education. There are a lot of people who sort of are orbiting around my interests, but I have kind of established like a patchwork quilt of advising, as opposed to having at the other program, it was sort of multiple faculty all within higher ed or education, that would have been more focused on what I was already interested in. And Berkeley is very oriented around like social theory, and this other department is not. So it was really like apples and oranges almost. Ultimately, this is kind of silly. I made a decision based on my personal life. My partner and I really wanted to move to California. And my partner got an amazing job in the Bay Area, and that kind of sold me. I think that I might have gone to the other program if not for that, because I think it was a little more familiar and a little more the brand of sociology that I was used to. And I think that would have been a massive mistake, actually. I think that I ended up going to the program that has certainly pushed me and pushed me outside my boundaries, and, working with faculty that aren't necessarily directly in higher education has its challenges, has its advantages and its disadvantages, but my advisors have really pushed me to think about things from a different perspective, and it's been such an opportunity for intellectual growth. So I would actually strongly encourage people to perhaps consider the department that they're not as excited about, that scares them. I think Berkeley scared me, and I wasn't sure that I'd be successful here. And it's that difference that has really allowed me to thrive and allowed me to grow as a person in terms of my intellectual viewpoints. And I think that people are often, like in undergrad, motivated by prestige and motivated by money, I guess. And I think that sometimes if you're able to afford it, going to a public school, I think, is really important. I think investing in public education is really important. Teaching a more diverse student body is really important, though obviously at an elite public school, you're still only getting a small snapshot of the real world. But I think it would have felt, I went to a private college for undergrad, and I think it would have felt pretty hypocritical to go from a private elite college for undergrad to a private elite college for graduate school while studying access to education for low-income students.
Very fair.
So I was really interested in being able to teach and work with and learn from undergrads who come from a more diverse background than the undergraduate population of the other school I was considering. So I think it's a variety of factors. I think the most important factor, which is maybe not what drove my decision, but drives most people's decisions, is the faculty that you want to work with. How are their mentorship records? Do you like them? Do you like the conversations you've had with them? When you get accepted to grad school, you get to meet the faculty that you'd be working with. And do you think that they will support you and help you be successful? And different faculty have better and worse mentorship records. And you might just really not like the person that you thought you wanted to work with. And that is a reason to stay away, regardless of the reason you don't like them. You're going to be talking to these people and working with these people for a long time, and you want to make sure you feel like they'll support you in being successful.
Those are some great tips and such excellent advice for
Thanks.
decision. No, but I say that very seriously. It is almost time to wrap up. So, firstly, what overall advice do you have for those who are toying with the idea of going to do a PhD and then, as you hope to do eventually, go into academia as well?
Get a research experience or two if you can, either by writing a thesis or being an RA or participating in any kind of research experience you can. This is to go into a PhD program. Obviously, by the time you're in the PhD program, you're doing a research experience. That doesn't necessarily apply to academia. Make relationships, foster relationships with faculty. This applies to everybody. To get recommendation letters, because recommendation letters will be important to you from the moment you enter your PhD program. When you get tenure, people have to write you letters of support. And your intellectual network is something that is important for the entirety of an academic career, from my understanding. So that applies for both college students and people who are, in their programs, though I am not far along enough to give people advice in terms of the graduate school experience. But for college students, get a research experience or two, make sure you actually like it, and make sure you want to do that kind of stuff day in and day out, and form close connections with your professors so that they can write you specific and detailed and real recommendation letters that aren't just kind of like the random things that you can write about people based on their transcripts and their information. You want to have specific stories of experiences they've had with you where they've seen you do something successfully and seen you do a successful project or write a really great paper. So those would be my academia top tips.
That's very useful. And then finally, to wrap up this episode completely, for you, Jackie, what's next?
I have to write my master's thesis. I started my analysis this month, and I'm starting to really think about what an academic paper would look like. I have my data, I have my analysis, or at least the beginnings of it. And now I'm kind of starting to think about like how am I framing it? What kind of literature am I going to be engaging in? And how do I want to position my findings to the world when I submit it to a journal? So yeah, writing my paper, write my master's thesis without having a mental breakdown.
You got this. I know you can. You're going to crush it. I mean, already it sounds like you are crushing it. And yeah. Thank you so much for coming on and letting me pick your brain. This has been so fun to learn all about, and I really appreciate